the Sackler Colloquia on the science of science communication, where scientists and communication professionals come together to write a better future for communicating science.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk with you today. We've got a very forbidding title there, Lay Narratives and Epstemologies. But actually, the title Epistemologies makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to try to address how this is relevant to the science of science communication. And perhaps a more user-friendly title would be, There is a Cultural Side to Science Communication. So one way of defining epistemology is notions about what is relevant, what's worthy of attention, what needs to be explained, as well as maybe some notions about what constitutes a good explanation. I love Baruch's way of defining it, different ways of looking at the world, and that will work quite well for us. So first of all, I'll just give you a very concrete example of different ways of looking at part of my world, the Chicago Loop. So you could decide to focus on Chicago architecture. For other purposes, for my purposes, the CTA is quite relevant. You could decide that you wanted to look at population density or median income. These are all representations that presumably are accurate, but they're different ways of looking at the world. For some purposes, none of these will be very good. You might be interested in hiking trails, dog walking areas, bird watching. Or if you're a geologist or a hot air balloonist, you might find this static representation not very useful to you at all. And if you're interested, for example, in the dynamics of traffic patterns, you would need a representation that included the temporal components. Okay, so I'm going to focus on one aspect of different ways of looking at the world. That is culture. A lot of work on culture has focused on East-West comparisons, where East is East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and West is typically equated with the USA. And what researchers have found is that fundamental cognitive processes differ across culture. One example is East Asians tend to pay more attention to background information and relationships than Westerners, who tend to attend more to focal objects. This is reflected in a number of different tasks. So if you show successive pictures that look very similar and ask participants what, if anything, is different, East Asians are much better at detecting background changes than Westerners, and Westerners are better at detecting foreground changes. This is also reflected in cultural artifacts. One of my favorite studies is by Masuda et al. First of all, they went into museums, analyzed portraits, and they looked for these portraits in the East and West, the ratio of face to the total area, and they found that Western paintings have 3 to 4 times as much representation devoted to the face, or another way of putting it, the East Asian portraits include more background information. They went on to do studies where they asked East Asians and Westerners, college students, to take photographs in the lab, and then they measured the same ratio, and the East Asian participants tended to take pictures that included more background information relative to the Westerners. In fact, it's remarkably similar to the data from the museum studies. And then in a third study, they asked what kinds of portraits you liked or didn't like, and that same difference was reflected in the aesthetic preferences. Okay, so here's why I think culture is relevant to science communication. Inevitably, science communication is done through artifacts, including language, different other kinds of representations. And I would like to argue that these artifacts both reflect the cultural assumptions of its creators and reinforce different ways of seeing the world. And if that's true, science communication needs to pay attention to culture and these different ways of looking at the world. So, as Baruch suggested, I'm going to focus on conceptions of nature and understandings of human-nature relationships. So, I'm an experimental psychologist, so I always like to collect data. You can be a participant in this study. I'm going to show you a number of slides, and your job is to tell me whether this is a nature scene or not. This happens to be a picture of the lowland rainforest in northern Guatemala. I'm assuming most of you will say it's a nature scene. This is a picture in rural Wisconsin. Maybe we'll start to get some division of opinion. Is this a nature scene? Is this a nature scene? If I told you that in the foreground there of the American Indian Center, this is a medicinal garden, would you now start to think it was a nature scene if you didn't before? The work I'm going to talk about involves a collaborative research partnership with 3 institutions: the American Indian Center of Chicago, the Menominee Nation of Wisconsin, and Northwestern University. First, a few comments about the American Indian Center. It's the oldest urban Indian center in the US. There are about 40,000 Native Americans living in the greater Chicago area. And as far as our research goes, it's a site for our urban ecology program. The Menominee are the oldest continuous residents of Wisconsin. They live on their much reduced reservation, and they're well known for their sustainable forestry practices. And about 4,000 to 5,000 Menominee live on tribal lands in and around 3 small communities. So the first piece of data I'm going to tell you about bear on distance between humans and the rest of nature. And these come from interviews with Menominee and European American parents and grandparents, where we were asking a variety of questions in this initial interview, including asking, what are the 5 most important things you would like your children or grandchildren to learn about the natural world? And I'm going to give you a very abstracted form of the data. We found very large differences in distancing discourse. When European American parents and grandparents talk about nature, they talk about it as an externality. They say, I want my kids to respect nature, know they have a responsibility to take care of it. Native American parents and grandparents were much more likely to say, I want my children to understand that they are a part of nature. This is a small piece of data, but I think it has wide-reaching implications. An experiment you could do for yourself is to go online to Google Images and enter ecosystems. I'll give you a sample of what you're likely to see. Here's one depiction of a couple of ecosystems. Here's another one, a little bit more elaborate. And here's yet a third. And if you've anticipated what I'm going to say, you would realize that humans were not represented in any of these ecosystems, and indeed, you'll look a long time before you find any depiction of ecosystems that includes humans. Is that because we don't have any impact on ecosystems? We don't have any role in them? Or is it because we perceive ourselves as being outside of ecosystems? Okay. I'm going to tell you an analysis we did of children's books. We wanted to see whether this difference in distancing would be reflected in children's books authored and illustrated by Native Americans or not. In one case, we took popular books on Amazon.com. They were targeted at 4 to 8-year-olds. There's a Native operated organization called Oyate, and we sampled books from them. We coded the pictures in a number of different ways. One is in terms of jargon associated with camera shots. So this is a voyeur point of view. You're just outside passively looking at the scene. Here's an embodied point of view that invites you to take the perspective of who's ever doing this cutting off the bark in this picture. Here's an over-the-shoulder shot that also invites you to take the perspective of a character in the story. We also analyze the pictures for subjective distance from the viewer, and also some other properties that I'm going to tell you about in just a second. So first of all, in terms of subjective distance, we do find that the native illustrations have more close-up and personal representations, but they also have more wide-angled representations. So there's a main effect of distance, but the key result is that the native illustrations give you more different perspectives. If we look at the angle the subjective angle of the viewer, we also find that the non-native books pretty much present this voyeur view, straight ahead and eye level, and the native books are much more likely to give you an alternative perspective. In this case, the one that's statistically reliable is looking from a high angle down at the scene. Similarly, the native books were much more likely to invite you to take the perspective of an actor in the scene by using either over the shoulder or an embodied representation. We've also done an analysis of the text that's in these books. Native authored books are reliably more likely to mention seasons and cycles. They're more likely to mention natural inanimates, things that would normally be part of the background from a Western perspective. They're more likely to mention native animals and to name them more specifically. And what I would like to suggest is that there are close parallels between these kinds of cultural artifacts and the data that we get from cognitive experiments on conceptions of nature. This would be hard to defend in an experimental design class, but this is one of my favorite experiments. The experiment involves asking Native American and European American adults in rural Wisconsin simply to tell us about the last time you went fishing. And what we counted was the number of words until the speaker mentioned fish. For the European Americans, on average, the median was the 27th word. They got to the point right away. For the Native American Menominees, the average was the 83rd word. They were much more likely to supply a lot of context and background information. And the reason we had to use medians rather than means is that several of the Menominee adults never actually got around to mentioning the fish. We've done parallel studies with Menominee and European American children. The data I'm going to tell you about come from probes where we gave children pictures. We might give them a picture of a robin and a pine tree, ask them if they have any particular relationship. But the data that I'm going to focus on are actually from spontaneous imitations of the animal's sounds. And it turns out about 40% of the Menominee children and 0% of the European American children spontaneously imitate or take the perspective of the animals in these scenes. We've also done extensive studies with fish experts, people who on the average have been fishing for 40 years. And trust me, we've established that they really are experts. They fish in the same areas, they use more or less the same methods, they target similar species. Menominee fish experts tend to focus a bit more on fishing as a food source. European American experts are somewhat more likely to focus on fishing as a sport and to practice catch and release. The first study I'm going to tell you about, we gave participants the names of 44 local species of fish on cards and asked them to put them into groups in a way that made sense to them. And the results were that despite the fact that both groups had 40 years of expertise, they seemed to organize their knowledge quite differently. So European American experts tended to sort either in terms of taxonomic relations, this is the bass family, or by goals, these are the large prestigious game fish. Menominee experts were much more likely to sort ecologically or by habitat. So they might say, these are the fish that you'll find in fast-moving water. We did a follow-up study where we probed for fish-fish interactions. So we would ask, do the walleye and the northern affect each other? Or does the walleye affect the northern? Does the northern affect the walleye? And again, even though the groups were equally expert, Menominee experts were much more likely to mention positive relations and reciprocal relations, more relations overall, and many of them involved the various stages of the life cycle of fish. European American experts mentioned many fewer relations, and they primarily involved adult fish. We think this is a matter of knowledge organization as opposed to knowledge per se, because in other follow-up studies, if we ask explicitly to sort by habitat, we find a consensus across groups and no group differences. And also, if the groups had the same ecological knowledge, we thought if you slowed the task down, the group differences would disappear, and that's exactly what we found. And when you slow the task down, the European American fish experts start answering questions in terms of the entire life cycle of fish. Okay. So the data so far indicate that artifacts and participants in studies seem to show parallel data on the place of humans in nature and ecosystems. We find large differences in attention to context, likelihood of taking another perspective and attending to relations, and in our other kinds of cognitive tasks, differences in taxonomic versus ecological orientation. If I go back to the data from 5 to 7-year-olds, it's also the case that 5 to 7-year-old Menominee children mention more ecological relations than their European American counterparts. Okay, let me summarize. I think there are some important implications for science communication. So the thesis I would like you to entertain is that science communication not only reflects but also reinforces particular cultural orientations and distancing and outsider perspectives, like in the girl looking at the ecosystem with a magnifying glass, may actually undermine engagement with science. Researcher use of terms like the public itself can be distancing and homogenizing. I have to say, we've done some work on community-based citizen science, And when I first thought about community members, I thought of just kind of a blank adult with no characteristics. But when you start to see what an actual community looks like and its diversity, you'll start to see that there are a lot of skills that quote-unquote community members bring to the setting. So at the American Indian Center, one of our community members worked in a chemistry lab, another person was a hydrologist. On the Menominee Reservation, someone had a master's degree in forestry and was able to use that to critique some of the ideas about forest prescriptions that were made by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I think it's important to be up close and personal even with the public. And finally, I'll just say that mismatches between lay epistemologies and orientations implicit in communication may be a source of alienation. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Brooke, and to the organizers for the invitation to speak. It's a pleasure to be able to comment on the highlights from Doug Medin and colleagues' phenomenal research project with the Menominee, and to have the opportunity to reflect on the implications of that for science communication. In Doug's talk, we heard that science communication must pay attention to culture and the corresponding different ways of looking at the world. And he provided a rich variety of evidence that the Menominee tend to take a psychologically close or first-person point of view on nature, unlike majority culture Americans. And the strategy that's implied and that he suggests in the paper in particular that he and Medin and Megan Bang wrote is to put a picture in the listener's head, one that might allow listeners to obtain a first-person perspective on it. So this raised a multitude of questions for me and a lot of insights, and I'm going to explore two of them here because I was seduced by his audience participation task, basically. The first is the landscape of artifacts, the everyday artifacts that might shape human views of humans in nature. Beyond books, what do children look at these days that shapes their perspectives and their epistemologies? And second, what shifts a person's point of view? How persistent or sticky are points of view, and how readily can we change them, and how readily do people change them themselves? So this is Knit Underground. Is this familiar to anyone? Maybe not. I think it's the wrong age group. This is by Niflas, a well-known in some circles, a software engineer who's written a ton of, quite a few games for children. And this is played quite widely by fairly young children. As you can see, it's a third-person point of view. It's a cutaway. It's underground. And do I have a pointer here? Let's see. Is this the pointer? Nope. Sorry about that. Can someone get rid of that for me? Thank you. Up there on the left, you'll see a little figure standing on what looks like the first tree. That's you as the player. So this is an underground game, and if you think of this as a nature scene, it's an exploration game where you're exploring nature the entire time. So, voyeur perspective. This, on the other hand, is Minecraft. This is very widely played among young children. Some of you are nodding your heads. Have you tried it? So you are that's your arm. The yellow block is your arm, and you are probably digging, as most of the kids do in this game. This is an action game, and so it's a first-person perspective, and it's an embodied perspective in Doug Medin's terms. And I have to say that I had to ask what the white square at the top was. That is the sun. Okay. In this game, Kerbal Space Program, you're about to launch the rocket that's in front of you there. And you can see here that this is somewhat of a voyeur or third-person perspective. One could ask if this is a nature scene. Apparently so. And this game, you have a choice of perspective. You can play it either in third-person perspective, as shown here, or you can play it with a first-person perspective. And the player I consulted said that this is much easier to play with a first-person perspective, with third-person perspective, because you can see the rocket better, and it gives you some feeling for the dynamics of the rocket. The player also has a choice in Minecraft on whether to play it first person or third person, but apparently almost no one plays it third person because it's easier to play first person when you're in Minecraft. So in a project a few years ago with the Mid-America Earthquake Center, we looked at visual strategies identifying earthquakes in popular earthquake films. So these are big shake films. And Ozge Samanci did this work. At the top, you can see a bird's eye view or a map view showing the consequences of an earthquake. So the yellow is, those are actually details on the deaths in a community from an earthquake. Whereas to the right here is what she'd identified as a first-person or narrative strategy of fleeing across split screens to safer zones within an earthquake. And the top view, is the bird's eye view, leaves you outside the scene, whereas the right view, the narrative view, pulls you into the scene. It's an insider's perspective. So as Doug pointed out, we map the world differently for different purposes. The basic metaphor, as shown in much work by Barbara Tversky, is proximity. This is a spatial metaphor, but it also carries through to other ways we think. We have embodied minds and points of view, so our spatial orientation affects the speed with which we process information even. And this switching, so for example, top to down is easier for us to discriminate than side to side, but our bodily axes and asymmetries affect how we process this information. And switching perspectives does slow down processing. So to bring this back to artifacts, readers form mental images from text. And once they've formed those images, studies of text comprehension have shown that they can then take a variety of perspectives on the text. And this is largely due to the abstractness of text, which affords these different possibilities. And this is illustrated quite wonderfully in translations. And here are two translations of an ancient poem by Wang Wei, Deer Park. There seems to be no one on the empty mountain, and yet I think I hear a voice where sunlight entering a grove shines back to me from the green moss. And then in Gary Snyder's translation from 1978, empty mountains, no one to be seen, yet here, human sounds and echoes. Returning sunlight enters the dark woods, again shining on the green moss above. These kinds of changes in perspectives we also see in the work that I've done with others on lay mental models of hazardous processes. And you can see in their own narratives that many of these narratives are rooted in specific personal experiences. So we asked people in Seattle in 2008 to tell us about the issue of climate change. And this respondent from Portland had a very personal story about climate change, and about 10% of our respondents felt like they had experienced climate change personally. Oh, something I think about all of the time. I pay attention to the weather myself all the time. I'm just sort of an amateur weather forecaster, and I've been doing that since I was a child. And you can see in the second part of her response here that she sees differences in weather patterns. So very sensitive to climate change as an accumulation of differences, and also slightly scared by it. We don't always see this, though. In many of the responses, you can see that people don't recruit personal experiences, and they may recruit multiple mental models from a variety of sources. And in this response, this is a follow-up to the initial prompt, this respondent said, well, I believe that we are contributing more carbon to the atmosphere through human activity, but then goes on to describe a number of other possible causes and sources of climate change, which are somewhat inconsistent. So in sum, stories create meaning. They make causality concrete and close, and because it's easy to induce this sense of psychological proximity in the lab also, that makes it seem malleable. But can stories alone afford readers the ability to shift fluently between points of view? The Menominee, as Doug's work shows in great detail, have broad environmental expertise, and that experience and expertise enables them to distinguish things, and to distinguish, for example, mere correlation and causation. And finally, which landscapes, in this landscape of artifacts, which artifacts actually matter for science communication? Thank you.
I thank Doug Medin's talk and the commentary, which leave me with in awe of the excellent participants here. And so what I want to talk about today is culture, symbol systems, and what the biological effects are of communication strategies and different cultures. So Medin and Bang elegantly demonstrate the totally wide-ranging effects of culture on artifacts or products to the way we perceive the world. And one question I ask here is, can cultural influences be enlarged? How far can they go? Can we introduce some of the findings here into the way we teach science, the way we learn science, or are there biological mechanisms by which culture actually influences the way we see the world and can be utilized in science communication? And we can ask questions such as, how is the brain involved? And are there epigenetic mechanisms? What are the mechanisms underlying the effects of culture on the way that we see and interact with the world? Now, one area here that is crucial is science education. And the old view of science education was that all we have to do when we teach our students is fill them full of facts and numbers and get them to memorize it back at the for the test. If you haven't seen the 5-minute university video, please look it up, and that is the sort of acme of the old view of science education. Now, starting in the 1970s, education changed the way science is taught. Instead of asking people to memorize facts, they asked students to construct knowledge. And this was at a social level as well as an individual level. And the children were asked questions about the nature of the universe, how things like time work, how motion works. So rather than expecting the children to give you the right answer, they wanted the children to discuss the answer so that the discussion was part of the learning process. And this has been a major change in science education. But one question here, and I think this is one we should all ask ourselves, is what if there are multiple valid epistemologies? What if your theory, which is different from mine, or my culture's theory, which is different from another culture's theory, what if they collide or clash? How can we use that in education? And one thing that has happened is people have described these rather than as naive conceptions that you might have of gravity to alternate conceptions and get students to confront counterexamples given by each other and experiments that they do in the classroom. And this way, they will come up with more representations, different ways of looking at the world. And the hope is that they will converge. And I think this is a very important question here about culture. If different cultures have different views of science, are we left with different sciences in different cultures? A nice example of this would be stem cell research, which is highly controlled and regulated in the US, yet in China and Korea, they are tackled in a very different way. And if in the Islamic world, it's tackled in a much more liberal way as well. And most of this stems from underlying cultural values about when life begins and when it doesn't begin. So coming up with alternate conceptions, for example, there's a screwdriver there. Can you use the screwdriver for other things? What other uses can you have for a screwdriver? Does it only have one use? And we've actually been exploring this using undergraduate students, graduate students, and we've collected thousands of answers to these questions. And one thing that we're trying to understand is, what if you change the perspective of the person? Will they So on the one hand, we could say that this is a scientist. On the other hand, you could say that this is a librarian. What will they do with these items? And so we've been exploring that once you change the perspective, you can get very different answers, and you can utilize these changes in perspective. Now, one way we've looked at this, which is complementary to Doug's view here, is working with native cultures to explain time. So I was lucky enough to be a consultant on Carl Karlstrom's project in the Grand Canyon, where there are at least 12 American Indian tribes who think of the Grand Canyon as their homeland. And when we had to build a trail around the Grand Canyon to explain time, we had to negotiate with the 12 different nations. And there were slightly different epistemologies. So there are cultures of science within different communities. There's cultures of science within science. How do we accommodate the differences? Can we communicate the differences in science in a positive way rather than this person has to be right and this person has to be wrong? And I think that is a major goal of science communication, is to be able to deal with differences in a positive kind of way. And what about culture? Does it change the brains? Work by one of Doug's colleagues here has shown that culture changes the way brains tackle particular problems. And little is known about the epigenetic mechanisms of cultural changes. Is it methylation? Is that a mechanism? And I'll stop here.
That's as bad a cop as I have in me, so I think. So let me think. So actually, the vision of the Sackler Colloquia is that individual sciences can't do it alone, and they need to bring people together, and they need to have conversations between one another. It's good to listen to one another's talk, but you then need to have an exchange in order to be sure you have have a proper communication, which is very much the theme of Kevin and Doug's responses. And so we've realized with this particular topic here in the science of science communication, we've brought together scientists who've not always thought of themselves as belonging to this community, and who have discovered, as the audience has discovered, that they all have valuable communications. We've also realized in the conceptualization of these meetings that scientists can't do this alone. We need the scientists who are subject matter experts. We need the scientists who know about how people understand, that we need the people who are on the ground making the direct connection with people with whom we'd like to have a dialogue, to understand their needs and to give them the information that we have that might be relevant to them, or to create information that might address their needs, which was very much in the spirit of the three talks that we had had today. So we have extensive time for audience participation, and we'd like to bring in, we have a very diverse audiences, and we invite you all to use the three modes of questioning that Barbara mentioned. But first, let me give Doug a chance to give a brief response to the two discussants.
Well, I very much appreciate it.
I think your mic, yeah. Okay, yeah, not sure. Just in case it isn't. Okay.
Very much appreciate actually both sets of comments, and I think it both underlines some of these general issues and raises some new issues. So, for example, I think distance is one factor, but that's also a very Western view of this body of research. And I think equally important is attention to relationships, perspective taking. Just as we went into the analysis of children's books expecting just simple differences in distance, and then we're surprised to find these huge differences. The other thing I want to say is actually in response to one of your initial comments about the culture of science. There are a set of practices associated with science that you could call a culture, but I think it's important that we do not shed our own cultures at the door when we enter into science. And therefore, I think the way that science gets done depends on the cultures of the people who are entering into it. And to me, that's one of the strongest arguments for diversity in the sciences, that science will be the better for it.
Thank you. So just to so our first question we have, just to show that we're taking things from all sources, is a tweet. And it's, if science communication reflects cultural orientation, how does the science community plan to rectify these cross-cultural translations?
That's for all of us?
Yeah, well, please. Don't fight over.
Well, I'll just give one example that perhaps doesn't address this directly, but indirectly. I think that part of the answer is diversity of scientists. A good example of this is research in primatology, where American researchers reflected this cultural orientation where we're distant from nature. So the prototypical study, this is before Jane Goodall, et cetera. The typical study in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the observers would go behind a blind, try to be as unobtrusive as possible, to observe the monkeys in their natural state. Japanese primatologists, however, conceptualized themselves as being part of nature at this point, and they did not hesitate to make themselves present with primates. And the discovery that many of you have heard about of cultural transmission in Japanese macaques, where one macaque discovers that dipping a sweet potato in water near the ocean removes the gritty sand. That discovery took place because Japanese primatologists were happy to provision the monkeys with a sweet potato so that they could observe them in the open. So in this case, there was a basic discovery about culture that American researchers wouldn't have made because it would have been out of bounds to provision the monkeys. So I'll stop there.
If I could give an example,
check your mic.
If I could give an example, I spent time studying North American labs, and then I spent a year studying Italian molecular biology labs. Now, the interesting thing is they all publish in the same journals. They publish in Nature and Science, and the articles all look the same. However, if you're at the lab meetings and you see how they construct the science, it's done in a different way. A lot of the American labs are very inductive in the way that they do the science, whereas the Italian lab that I was looking at was much more deductive, and everybody essentially asked the professor, what do you think and what's your prediction? And if the professor said it was like this, that's the way it was. But once it got written up, it looked like they were exactly the same methods used in both types of labs. So you can see cultural differences being diminished in one of the ways of communication. And I think that's a very interesting phenomenon.
I have a question. Maybe I'll direct this one to Anne. What would be some terms that scientists could use other than public? And I guess by implication, what's the loading of public?
Well, the first loading for me, at least, is them, not us. And there are a variety of terms that, as you all know all too well, there are a variety of terms that you can use. Other names of people's professions, of the groups that they're involved in. So people who are representing the community may be community representatives. You may talk about people who are taking civic responsibility as the stakeholders or the policy makers in the question. You could think in science terms about what kinds of roles they have with the science. So for example, are they clients using technologies that people are producing? Are they consumers of specific sciences in chemical products? And so thinking about the roles that they play vis-a-vis the science that's being done is the important part here, to think about what the relevance of it is for them rather than labeling everybody the public.
Thank you. We have 2 microphones in the audience. Could you put up your hands and then yeah, let's.
Hi, I enjoyed your talk. My question is, how did you control for your own epistemology in your experimental design?
That's an excellent question. I think we made an attempt to do that by having a diverse research team. In the case of the children's books and coding the pictures, we had both Native American and European American coders, because we actually thought there might be a cultural difference in the perception of the pictures. It turns out we didn't find a difference. It does make a difference. Just to give you one example, we've been trying to do community-based and culturally-based science education. And I have to tell you, this is a confession, we did summer science programs, and my focus was on the kids who were in the programs. And we did, pre-tests, post-tests, and I thought, if we're doing science education, we're doing it with kids, we should focus on the kids. My wiser collaborators suggested that we also should videotape what's going on in the communities that are planning these meetings. We should look at the teachers, we should look at the settings that we're in, and we ended up with a much richer set of data by virtue of that. So for me, I've benefited a lot from having a fairly diverse research team.
Thank you. We had a hand on the second, could I have a, yeah.
Hello. Thank you. The talks were excellent. I'm a little confused by some of the distinctions. The idea of distancing and the idea of establish where you place yourself in relations. I don't see them as being so distinct and different. If Eastern communities relate to the environment that they're in, then they are not distancing themselves from the environment. And if Westerners don't relate to the environment, then they are distancing themselves. I tend to think of it more in terms of convergence and divergence. The two studies that you talked about where inductive researchers, there's always an impetus to write the way the journal wants it written so that you get accepted. But assuming that that's not the case, what are these distinctions real, or are they part of just the nomenclature that we're using?
First.
I can answer the converger, diverger. What we do is we ask people to take a one perspective or another perspective. And what they say and the way their brains work changes as a result of asking them to change their perspective. So there are things that they would not have said if they had taken we have one group we don't tell them to take any perspective. We've another group, we've told them to be librarian, another group to be a crazy artist. And they come up with radically different, both quantitatively and qualitatively, different semantic spaces. And you can actually get we've done this between groups and within groups, and we get the same kinds of findings. So that these different perspectives can radically alter your understanding. Now, whether it's temporary or permanent, I think that's the question. We in the lab could come in and it looks like we've changed people, but it may be the case that it's a lifetime of acculturation that's passed through generations that you need for these changes. I don't know what.
Yeah, just to supplement Kevin's comments, there is evidence that cultural artifacts have causal force. So, for example, in these east-west differences in attention to foreground, background, Miyamoto and some other researchers presented Americans with typical Japanese scenes or typical American scenes. And if you give, I think it was as few as 95 pictures of Japanese scenes to American participants, they become relatively better at detecting background changes. And then there's other work that Anne alluded to that suggests that different representations succeed in leading to different forms of perspective taking. So I guess my hunch is that they're probably both chronic and acute. I mean, there's other work showing that Eastern brains are different from Western brains, just like London taxi drivers have different brain activation. So again, I think it's chronic and to some extent flexible.
Well, these things are reinforced by the roles that people take in the world. So people have a set of actions that they undertake in their everyday lives, and those tend to reinforce their cultural positions and their way of thinking about the world. We find in some of the survey work that we've done that people do tend to have a consistent pattern of beliefs from causality through to what they think should be done about a problem. So for example, for climate change, they may have a view that, that the most effective interventions are engineering interventions, that you should seed the oceans or use dust in the atmosphere, and then they'll tend to support those policies. So we see a pattern of beliefs that seems fairly stable, and yet when you look at individual beliefs, we know very well from work on judgment decision-making and psychology that people's views are very susceptible to context, and what they say will often depend largely on the context.
Here's a question, a remote question, or I guess a question from away. If culture so strongly influences points of view, would increasing diversity in scientists and science communicators be more powerful or as powerful than understanding audiences better?
Well, I don't know how to answer the comparative question. I just think it's important to pay attention to the cultural assumptions that are associated with science communication. So if we don't think of ourselves as completely independent of the rest of nature, then it's kind of odd that we use representations that seem to implicitly adopt that point of view. So if I were in science communication, one of the things I would try to do is to provide a different perspective on human nature relationships. So another experiment you could do on Google Images is enter scientist and see what you get. You'll start to see more diversity, but you'll get the impression that all science is done indoors, in labs. And that's simply not true.
Can I add to this? I teach a class on scientific thinking, and the class is, there's 35 students in the class, and the first thing I do in the first class is ask them to draw a scientist, and half the class are women and half are men. Only one person drew a woman scientist this year. It's the most extreme I've seen it, but you can see that there are stereotypes of science which are not reflective of science, and it seems to vary within disciplines and between disciplines, but I was shocked by this kind of result, and it showed that we as scientists are not doing a great job of communicating what science is.
Just one final thought. If you turn the question kind of on its head, one of the most effective forms of communication is interaction. And so maybe some of us are thinking about science communication as message design, but interaction is a much more fundamental component.
For many years, I've wanted to use the line from Ghostbusters, "Back off, man, I'm a scientist." It's never been appropriate. So. Let's have a couple of questions from the audience. Yeah.
So I'm Jonathan Garlick from Tufts University, and I'm going to pick up with your last slide about epigenetics. I'm a stem cell researcher, and I study epigenetics and methylation. And I think that that's an opportunity. And what I mean by that is that it seems that the pendulum is swinging back from, or at least we like to hope so, is swinging back from a perspective of nature to a perspective of nurture. And what that informs, perhaps, and gets to my question, is there some way to develop an anticipatory approach, considering what we know is emerging in our laboratories, that will allow these alternative conceptions to be more positively viewed by being more proactive? So in other words, taking what we're doing in the laboratory, allowing that to inform the way we can prepare to somehow address the alternative perceptions that will be evolving in the public sphere.
Yeah, so there were one or two studies that looked at epigenetic changes following educational interventions that were very suggestive. And I think the way to induce conceptual change in students and to encourage them to think of things in new ways is obviously mediated by biology. We looked at stereotype threat and cortisol levels, and we found that the mechanism of stereotype threat was mediated through cortisol levels. So the question for us is really, what do we know about biology that can inform the way science education works? Is to actually use the science to change the science education. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Take a question. Oh.
Yeah, I have a question. When the differences are very large, like in the case of stem cells, where you have the Asians and Islamic people with a different notion, culture, much more liberal than the Westerners, like the US and Europeans, that are much more restricted. Do you see a need to reconcile it? Or do you see, if so, how would you do it?
I don't see that we could reconcile it. There are cultural differences which are deeply rooted in religious beliefs that lead to science being banned in some places and encouraged in other ways. And I think that it's good that we do it in different ways, and I think it's essentially like a peer review by the world of science. And it's healthy that they have different views, but I don't think they can be all reconciled into one.
Here's, I think, a related question, from a submitted question. How do we apply the idea of multiple valid conceptualizations from a scientific point of view in thinking about evolution and creationism as alternative conceptualizations?
Well, I think that's an interesting case in point, because research on evolution uses the scientific method, and as I understand creationism, it doesn't. So I don't see creationism as a non-empirical perspective as having a place at the table. More broadly, however, I think that diverse perspectives that use the scientific method, or methods, are very good. For example, in psychology, a lot of our research focuses on individuals, but there's equally valid research that focuses on particular environments and the cognitive consequences of being in different environments.
Here's a question that gets back to the talks and the comments. I wonder what time spent in nature has to do with different perspectives. Given the time children now spend on the web, how will this affect their perspective towards nature?
Well, I'd like to elaborate on the question. There is a certain amount of physics embodied in these games, and it's more or less useful physics. So I don't know how it extrapolates from people's virtual experiences to the real world. And there's been some research that has shown, for example, that there is an influence of playing a lot of these car games. And what are they called? They're auto racing games. That if you race a lot, then that may actually influence your actual driving in the real world. I don't think we know yet the extent to which these kinds of games influence children's interactions with nature. I do know that some kids are hard to get out in nature. They'd rather play with nature virtually. So, that's an open question. Maybe some of you have answers.
I think that's a great empirical question that we should look at. I was waiting for a question to make this comment, but I'm going to take the advantage of the time to make just one comment. There are 560 some federally recognized tribes, and I've just told you about data with the Menominee tribe of Wisconsin. And so first of all, you shouldn't generalize to all Native people. Secondly, within cultures there is great diversity. So a lot of the work we do tries to trace within cultural differences to different kinds of experiential variables and the like. So a box model of culture isn't really going to cut it. So for example, for some of the effects I told you about, Menominee kids taking an animal's point of view, that was 40% of the Menominee kids. It wasn't even a majority. It's just that compared to 0%, that's a very large difference.
I'd like to elaborate on that. In one of the recent projects we've been doing, we were looking at different groups that are involved in emergency response to hurricanes. And one of the things that's, for me, a surprising finding from this is we found, by and large, the differences we expected in mental models of hurricane forecast and warning systems in the emergency responders and in the broadcasters and in the hurricane forecasters. But the biggest differences were within the category of the hurricane forecasters who had the most expertise. And those differences swamped the differences between the other groups. So just to elaborate on Doug's point.
We have time for, I think, one more question.
A question in the interest of getting things done a little bit. We've been hearing about contrasts among cultures and their perspectives on things. A lot of those cultures are the cultures we'd like to see represented in science as underrepresented groups. But current models for training emphasize acquiring a new identity as a scientist. That tends to crush alternative cultures. In fact, it's very difficult for an undergraduate to become successful in a laboratory without leaving an awful lot of the previous culture behind. Are there good tips for maintaining alternative cultures in an individual? Is it really possible for us to have two identities and cultures operating at once?
I just make one quick comment. Lots of times I ask undergraduates why they're choosing their field of study. In the case of students going into medicine, it often reflects their deepest values. They've had a grandmother who spent a lot of time in the hospital, etc. In the case of science disciplines, we don't get a lot of discourse about reflecting your deepest values. And I think there's a problem there, because I think what makes science exciting is that it does, in fact, allow us to express some of our deepest values. So I think we need to get that across.
Let me thank our audience. Let me thank our speakers, and we'll have a break.